Hello, I'm Michael Francis, Music Director of the Florida Orchestra, and welcome to this, the third of our WSMR broadcasts, which will be available on Thursday at 7 o'clock on WSMR. This is a truly heroic program. We have Richard Strauss's Don Quixote in the first half, followed by Beethoven's heroic or Eroica Symphony in the second, but in an unusual version, as arranged by Gustav Mahler, very rare indeed. So Richard Strauss's Don Quixote, based upon the great novel written some 400 years ago by Miguel de Cervantes. If you don't know the story, I'll give you a quick recap. Alonso Quixote is a gentleman who loves to read chivalrous novels with daring tales of knights rescuing damsels and battling monsters. But he reads too many of them. He isolates himself from his family and actually starts to go mad until he actually believes that he is Don Quixote of La Mancha. And he heads off on his trusty steed, accompanied by the bumbling peasant squire Sancho Panza, to a series of escapades and mishaps and misunderstandings, generally involving them being humiliated and beaten. At the end of this, through a kind villager called Samson Carrasco, he recognizes that how to bring Don Quixote back into reality. He battles him, and at the end of the story, Don Quixote dies, but contentedly, in reality, surrounded by his loved ones, recognizing the error of his ways. Well, if it takes 23 or 24 hours to read the full, long, wonderful novel by Miguel de Cervantes, Richard Strauss manages to say so much in just under 45 minutes. This is almost a cello concerto. And we're very fortunate to have brought over Maximilian Hornung from Germany, who's been with us now 3 times with the Florida Orchestra. But it also features a very important solo viola part for Derek Mosloff, our star solo violist, as Sancho Panza. So the music begins and we have this aristocratic perfume in the air, something noble and gentlemanly. But as the introduction continues, all these crazy ideas, this confused mind starts to unfold before us. And the music gets increasingly convoluted and concentrated and rich and strange until we head up to this enormous dissonant chord, and that's the moment where Alonso Quixote's mind finally snaps and he thinks he's Don Quixote. Then the solo cello arrives in the theme. From this point we have a theme and variations, and the theme arrives and we hear Sancho Panza as well, and then we head into our first variation, which is the battle with the windmills, followed by the most famous of all the variations, the battle with the sheep, who he thinks are some onsetting army. And the music he does to describe the sheep is very humorous. You'll hear the winds bleating, and you'll hear these wonderful sounds heading around the orchestra. It's very humorous, and was rather controversial at the time, as you could imagine. There's many other escapades with him fighting monks or fighting magicians. In fact, they were just normal people, but of course he always ends up losing. But in the middle of it, we have a Knight's Vigil, which is the 5th variation. This is a moment for the solo cello to really reflect as Don Quixote, with his armor next to him, as he heads out for battle the next day. What will be his fate? For whom is he fighting for? What is the purpose of his life? Very powerful, subtle music. Perhaps the other most inventive of the variations is the Ride Through the Air, because this is where Richard Strauss uses a wind machine, this giant machine that's designed with sort of almost like a rough paper or sandpaper around this wooden thing, and it does the sound just like the wind. Again, another controversial choice. At the end of it, in the 10th variation, is the battle where Samson Carrasco dresses up as a knight of the White Moon and knocks sense into Don Quixote, and the final epilogue when the solo cello sings this glorious soliloquy, ruminating upon one's past errors, upon love lost, upon the mistakes, and actually dying surrounded by his loved ones in reality. This music shows the power of music to take us not just to enjoy the narrative, not just to laugh at the silly situations and scenarios they find themselves in, but to feel their pain, to feel their joy, feel their laughter. Music, of course, takes us beyond the intellectual straight away into that, and it does it so incredibly well in this Technicolor piece. And talking of Technicolor, of course, this was a concert which we have with our visual artist in residence, Jeff Strick, whose incredible images were up above us, telling the story at the same time as listening to the music. It was a magical, magical evening. And for me, the most touching aspect of Don Quixote and this music and the story is the idea of love and patient love and loyalty. For Sancho Panza's loyalty to his master Don Quixote sort of reminds me of Samwise Gamgee with Frodo Baggins in Lord of the Rings. And it is that patient love, that loyalty, that eventually brings Don Quixote back into normality and into reality. It also shows us the dangers of isolation. Be careful how many books you read. You too could end up like Don Quixote, flying off and attacking trees and windmills, thinking they're giants and all sorts. In the second half, we come to Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. He wrote this when he knew that he was going deaf. In his early 30s, he'd written the Heiligenstadt Testament, which is a letter to his brothers admitting that he was losing his hearing, which of course for a composer was the worst possible fate. But to understand Beethoven is not just to understand his deafness, but to understand his political intentions. For that we need to go back to 1789, when he was 19 years of age, an impressionable student at university at the time of the French Revolution. And it was here that he really developed a kinship and an empathy for the ideals of the French Revolution. Of freedom, of equality, of brotherhood. Of course, he hated what Robespierre did with it, turned it into despotic control. But Beethoven really did idolize Napoleon Bonaparte, which is important to understand this symphony. For indeed, this symphony was originally called the Bonaparte Symphony. But upon hearing in 1802 or 1803 that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, he scratched out with his quill the name Bonaparte, apparently saying to his first biographer, or according to the first biography, oh, he's nothing but a mere mortal. And this music, if it's not about Bonaparte and it's about the heroic qualities, well to whom is it about? Well, let me offer you an interesting view. What I think is interesting as I'm saying it. The first movement starts with these two epic chords, as we know, and of course that famous theme heading down to these strange syncopations in the cellos. The first movement shows a hero in full armour, in full garb, in full power and full might, the prime of their life. There's sort of an equestrian quality to the military writing, reminding us of David's painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps on that huge mighty horse, showing his adventure. But also all the way through this first movement, you feel something more sophisticated and subtle. There's always doubt. And indeed, the moment of the most extraordinary battle, about 2/3 of the way through the first movement, in which you hear the orchestra just repeat these increasingly dissonant chords, leading to the final one, which has harmonies that, if Stravinsky wrote it, would have been revolutionary. Just after this, orchestra seems to just crash. There's a new theme of mourning. So we know the cost of battle because we can sense it. This isn't a sociopathic hero. This is a hero with a heart who senses those who have been lost around him or her. And the first movement ends with this sort of sense of victory, but at what cost? We see a real three-dimensional, multi-dimensional understanding of the character. And in the second movement we understand why, because this is a funeral march. And clearly when it starts there's a military flavour to it. But the way that Beethoven develops his funeral march from something rather touching and noble, he starts to really show the various stages of grief in the most astonishing and cathartic way. There's an incredible outpouring that happens with all the strings in this fugal writing, then followed by this screaming rage that starts with the double basses and cellos thumping out these low notes. And finally at the end, as time seems to stand still with the tick-tocking of the clock, the last utterance is fractured, broken, as if some things cannot be spoken fully, for indeed where words fail, music speaks. So we've had the rise of this hero, we've had the fall, perhaps Achilles had lost Patroclus, who knows? But there's something tender and more desolate at the end of the second movement. Well, the third movement is sort of a soldier's or a student's song. There are some rather naughty words set to it, apparently, that Beethoven knew, a sort of a hidden meaning that he had. But it's really of great buoyancy and fun and revolution and finding oneself back again. It's the ascent after the fall. So I mentioned this is arranged by Mahler. What Mahler did is he basically beefed up all the winds and brass. So instead of 3 horns, you have 6. Instead of 2 flutes, you have 4 flutes, and so on and so forth. But in the trio of the third movement, instead of these 3 horns, these pompous generals pontificating about where they are, clearly with a drink in their hand, you have 6 horns, and it sounds epic. It is an amazing, amazing feeling. And if you remember in the performance, I asked them to stand at that moment just to add to the ceremony and also the projection of the sound. Well, the fourth movement begins with this almighty flourish. Clearly the hero is about to arrive, and it cascades down into this astonishing moment of pause. Who is it? And then what precedes is very unusual, because what you'll hear is this bass line, dum, 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 dum. And what is that? That's not a melody. In fact, he's taken it from an earlier contradance based upon the creatures of Prometheus. That's important. Why? Well, who was Prometheus? Well, Prometheus was half god, half man. He was one of the Titans. And he, of course, supposedly made man out of clay. And he was told by the gods just to enjoy them, but not to bestow any gifts upon them, particularly of wisdom, of enlightenment, of empathy, of understanding, of searching, effectively letting them bite from the apple. But he did, and his punishment for this was that he was chained to a rock, and every day an eagle will come down and pluck out his liver, and that would happen for eternity. A cruel thing for someone who just bestowed knowledge to those around him. Well, the music which I badly sung for you is called an English dance. And the reason it's important, not just because it's English, because it is a representative of a dance in which the master could dance with the servant. It was the only one of its kind. So there's a sense of equality. And as the fourth movement progresses, sort of developing out of this very, very simple, humble beginnings, you start to feel very sophisticated conversation, wild parties going on, until you come to a halt, and then this slow music appears. It's like a glimpse of Elysium, of Arcadia. It's almost like John Lennon's Imagine what could happen in the world. It's Beethoven wistfully offering an example of what enlightenment is. True heroism is not about conquering, it's about giving back. It's about helping others. And then of course the symphony ends in that glorious race to the end of tremendous speed and buoyancy and vivacity. And for me, that really is the heart of this symphony. The heroic quality is the course with great strength comes great responsibility. Pardon me for quoting Spiderman, but that's sort of that idea of what is going on in the symphony. But perhaps there's something even more heroic here. For we know that Homer, when we think of Achilles, was blind. We know that Beethoven was going deaf. It's that wonderful, encouraging, incredibly inspirational reminder that no matter what afflicts us, that sense of perseverance, that sense of pursuit of beauty, it's so powerful because often out of adversity comes the greatest beauty. We hope you enjoy the concert. Thank you very much.